Labor and the expression of worth.
I got my boots on the ground. I got my boots on the ground. I got my boots on the ground.
With every death, there is a new incarnation. Traveling Trav here, Romano's State Park. Lake Watonga is low, and it appears to have been for some time. Truly, I have lived a rich life. Opportunity in abundance. I have experienced a great nurturing, a great care. I have been raised up, tutored from one profession, location, relationships, many friendships, layer upon layer of friendships, clinical care that I gave in physical therapy, learning to be a hands-on healer, and learning to understand the limitations of my capacity to heal. I've been spending my time in the Oklahoma City area, and when I arrived at Romano's State Park this morning and finally exited Little Blue, what I noticed was the silence. There's a very clear and present silence. It reminded me of New Mexico. I'm gonna do a little field surgery. Got an infection in this finger. String playing is out right now, which is kind of a big deal at this stage of my development to let that go for just a moment. It's such a source of comfort and help to me. So I got a Band-Aid, I got some Neosporin, and I got this needle, and I believe I located something. I looked at it through this flashlight here, this bright light. I turned this on, and then I could see, through my, I can see a couple of places where there might be something in there. I think because I have the calluses, I don't feel it so much, and then my body's still trying to reject it. So there's this gradual process of kind of getting used to the pain, just kind of poking and sticking, and I feel like there's some pressure that needs to be released in here. I took a trip to the Pecos Mountains once, a solo backpack journey. I'd been several times with my son, but this trip, it was a pilgrimage. Yes, there was a specific journey that I knew I had to take. I wanted to know what it was like to spend the night up on top of a mountain by myself and to see how much more difficult it might be to go up that mountain if I was all by myself. I suppose sometimes we go out into the wilderness by ourselves. It's a prescribed spiritual practice. When I arrived at the trailhead, at the sign-in, it said, "Beware of cougars that have been hunting recently in this area. Stay with your traveling partner." It was a long hike that day by myself. For the first several hours, I was hyper aware, watching out for cougars. Eventually, the exhaustion that comes with hiking set in, and there was a surrender, and then it was so immensely difficult to get to 11,000 feet without my son by my side. I did a wild dance before God up on that mountain, metaphorically and literally. And then I made camp, built a big fire, and I went to sleep in my tent to the crackling and roaring glow of that fire. What was probably several hours later, I awakened. It was raining slightly. The fire had gone out. It was very dark. It was smoldering. And I heard this sound. Coming from outside the tent. Now, I had made my trip up that mountain with the intent of offering my head to Kali Ma. Hindus, those who were gathered by the Indus River, understood that God has 1,000 faces, just as Carl Jung understood that we must do business with the archetypes, as he left his teacher, his materialist teacher Freud, behind, saying, no, we must have this noumenal experience. We must face the shadow and make this journey in the spirit of Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey, right? That Christ in us, that one life that wants to be lived out through us. So it had been with this intent that I made my way up the mountain that day, and why it was particularly concerning to me when I heard coming from outside my tent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, hoping that I would just fall back asleep and be able to ignore the sound. But it persisted, and I found myself cowering under my covers, just hoping that it would go away. But it did not go away. I felt that I would panic. I felt myself starting to panic. "Do you want panic on top of a mountain?" said my father. "What will happen if you panic up on top of a mountain, son?" "You'll have panic up on top of a mountain, father." "And I will eventually have to come to some kind of something. I would rather not panic up on top of a mountain in the middle of the night in fear," which is what panic is, yes? So I sat up into my half-lotus meditative position. My head, the top of my head just inches from the roof of the tent, and I could hear the rain dripping, and I could also hear the sound out there. It continued. And then I remembered a teaching that says, "Go to the places that scare you." And that was the spirit in which I had approached all of this in the first place, is doing hard things, lifting heavy objects, pushing oneself like Sisyphus, pushing that rock up the hill, insisting performance of oneself, insisting a ceremony, going out somewhere that we don't know what's going to happen, bringing uncertainty, saying yes to uncertainty. Well, you could just put on your sandals, unzip that tent, and just walk right out into that. Because you said you came here for a death. And so if it is death that is awaiting you outside of this tent, well, that's an option. This was a voice from inside, yes. And then there was another one, a more shallow one here saying, oh, I do not want to go out there. But the cowering one said, "I will sit in the half lotus and I will wait. And if I start moving toward my sandals and the zipper, I will not stop myself." And that is exactly what happened. I found myself moving in that direction. Sandals on, zipper. The sound had stopped by this time. And I went out into the darkness. And I sat by the warmth of the smoldering fire. And then I remembered the cougars. And my imagination started running wild, feeling so vulnerable sitting in the dark up on top of this mountain by myself. Very vulnerable. And from the cougar, I went to Gollum, imagining him creeping about out there beyond anything that I could see. A flashlight only seemed to make it scarier with the moving shadows, and I gave that up. So I was sitting upright, just experiencing this fear, feeling at any moment I was going to be devoured by everything. Just thoughts, emotion. And then I was drawn, my attention was drawn I realized how quiet, how still it was up on top of that mountain, and that nothing had devoured me up to that point, and that even if I were to be devoured, I would probably be in the best state for whatever occurred if I could listen into that stillness. And as I listened into that stillness, I became the stillness. I made an intention. I turned my heart, I turned my will toward this exquisite stillness. And then, of course, my mind would wander back to the fears. Over and over again that night, I do not know how long, I just continued returning to the stillness. The rain dissipated, the clouds parted. There was a reflection of the moon on the water. There was haze. There was a sound of the stream. When I was 4 years old, the movie Jaws was really profoundly informative. This creature that comes out of the sea and onto the boat to devour the captain, the overcoming of this heartless, black-eyed sea creature whose only intent is to devour you. I have heard that oftentimes in the past our gods required sacrifices of blood, sacrifices of human, that the gods consumed the people. And somehow with the Christ, I believe I heard this teaching from Richard Rohr, somehow with the Christ is the God who says, consume me, eat of my flesh, and drink of my blood. And we have heard this story of how Jesus was a man who was God, who died for us, whose death paid our ransom. And so the story goes that somehow we rely on that ransom that was paid. And otherwise, if the God-man had not done this, then God would be angry with us eternally, that there had to be a father had to sacrifice a son for there to be peace in the world. I had deep resentments for many years over what I called Bible Belt religious fundamentalism. I found that the reason I had such deep resentments for that is because that fundamentalism, destructive, closed fundamentalism, was deeply ingrained in myself, and I had to go on a long journey to understand that. I'm speaking of a righteousness that is derived from self, a self-righteousness that we may acquire as we seem to master any form. Now I can begin to see how they could work as a unit without that first finger in there, if they had to. I think I would work on my stretch, I'd get even a bigger stretch here.